So it's great. It's great to be with Felicity, Scott, and Keller Easterling. If this is a series of conversations with non-boring people, we start with the least boring of all. And also, it's kind of it just occurred to me like 5 minutes ago that there's also this historical resonance, if you can say that, because I think Felicity, my whole Wachsmann obsession. I mean, you're responsible because when you asked me to write that thing for Grey Room, what seems like at the beginning of the century, in a certain way, I never got over that. And I don't know if you also have sometimes that experience that you write something and it keeps following you. And so Wachsmann has sort of followed me, or let's say the Wachsmann that I sort of invented in my mind chose to come with me rather than to stay wherever that Wachsmann used to be, right? So then this thing has sort of followed me, and you're a dog expert, right? So I guess it's in my head, but there's Wachsmann. Every time I turn around, there he is. So at some point, there was the opportunity to make a little book, and precisely because this dog is so playful, it didn't become it's a big little book or a little big book or whatever. But it's really a great. I mean, I'm really excited to sort of talk with you about some of these questions, especially, the main question, I suppose, for me is sort of like about whether television is gone, like we're in sort of post-TV world, or whether it's the opposite, that we are so deep in TV now that it doesn't identify, it's not like an individual, like everything is sort of televisual. And these two claims are obviously impossibly grand. And part of the reason I love the work of both of you is you don't allow this kind of irresponsibility. So I also feel like in this half hour, you could tame me somewhat. But I'm curious, like, whether it makes sense to think of this as a kind of post-TV moment, or an Uber TV moment, or is even just the idea of TV a bit old? Felicity, you want to fix me?
Let me think. I mean, we're all, of course, now living in our own personal TV studios. But we're also all living what was once a dream of seeing ourselves on TV. And so I think, on the one hand, I think, yes, we're in a type of televisual moment, but one that has a incredibly convoluted topology vis-a-vis sort of early dreams about democratizing television or opening television up to other participants. And I say that because, as you know, I've been fascinated with all these early moments of so-called sort of radical television or radical video,
right.
of Ant Farm, or even of Michael Schamberg and guerrilla television, or spaghetti, television. All these characters who imagined that they could institute a mode of feeding back into the system that would destroy the sort of commercial broadcast model of a one-way transmission. And they all imagined that would somehow have a sort of liberatory dimension to it. And so, when Ant Farm took the media van on the road for the truck stop network performance, for want of a better word, the idea that people would see themselves on television was somehow, imagined to be a moment of surprise, like seeing your name, in the newspaper in generations before. And I point this out because that was considered somehow experimental, but that was happening at exactly the same time that the world we're now living in, the internet world, was being invented with ARPANET, and some of these same characters were also behind early experiments trying to render sort of ubiquitous that connection and dismantle the seemingly one-way, direction of television transmission. So I sort of agree that television is critical, both, in thinking about all these forms of resistance that was so incredibly naive in fighting against television, while at the same time being integrated into this distributed apparatus that increasingly operated through the same system and now operates explicitly through the same system, through the internet. So I don't know if that means it's post-televisual in the sense of being haunted, by a sort of ongoing trace of the televisual. So don't know if that answers your question, but
No, it's really fascinating because, as you say, I mean, the television is almost like a word that is simultaneously a sort of name of political liberation and the name of imprisonment, right? So it's so in the hands of one group of artists, it's a new society of transparency and interactivity, and the very same word and the very same technology at the very same time is kind of the beginnings of incredibly efficient, perhaps the most efficient in history, systems of control. And so maybe, this is partly also the fascination of Wachsmann, like, to ask which side he's on, for example, might be a mistake since these are not sort of separated. And I was thinking when you were talking that I remain indebted to McLuhan and just sort of am still in love with this idea that we never see the world that we're in, that we only see the one that's gone. And according to that view, the post-TV world would actually be the only time you'd get to see TV or write a book about it, for example, or three of us could talk about it because it's gone. So in a way, there's such a naivety in this question. And yet, when you have a reality TV star not just pretending to be president, but to our horror being so, then it seems we never did get out of the TV thing, and we might be just getting into it. That would be even more like alarmist, would be to say, and now it begins, right? Because maybe McLuhan was wrong, right? Like maybe it's also the other way around, that instead of always looking in the rearview mirror, maybe actually, weirdly enough, we get to see more clearly the future than we do the present. I don't know. But Keller, of course, in your medium design book, I'm thinking like we turn to you for wisdom as always, right?
I guess when I was reading your book, one of the things that I was thinking about was how over the whole of the 20th century, from sort of radio to satellite to TV to all these forms, that they, just as you were saying, Felicity, of course, each new platform, everyone declares, now we've found democracy. We have found the elementary particle of the platform in which we will now all be liberated. And that never works. There's always some monopoly, some choke point in all of that. But I ended up thinking about, especially around 1945 and so on, I ended up thinking about Arthur Clarke's extraterrestrial relays and the idea, that you were going to govern the whole world with TV and other forms of, airborne communication, from radio to satellite to late 20th century broadcast TV to what we have now. And they seem to just be in a big mix, borrowing each other's repertoires at different times. So I don't see a post-TV, but what I saw in your book, for instance, was a really interesting synthesis of that mid to later part of the 20th century idea of what the televisual, could be.
Yeah, it's funny because this morning I was thinking, that feeling like I better remember what I wrote in the book, right? Before I talk about it. So I was suddenly saying to myself, oh yeah, what if Keller or Felicity asked me, when did Wachsmann first use the word television? And then suddenly I realized I don't have the answer. I remember, and that's ridiculous, right? Yeah. Having written such a book. But I know that, for example, exactly in that moment you're talking about, right after the Second World War, Wachsmann is at this big conference of all the modern heroes of architecture. All the boys are there, and he's saying it's all about electronics, and it's really, and he's not quite using the word television, but it's like on the tip of his tongue, as it were, and pretty much from that point on, television is the word. And I think he doesn't quite use the word yet, and so in a way he kind of sort of targets this sort of world of vibrations, like you were saying, the world of the air, that architects seem to find super embarrassing. Like they just, even now, I think that the idea for many people who love Wachsmann, the idea that he's really a television person or even a television program, that's the main, let's say, argument, would be highly offensive. It's really like the ultimate insult that finally we have somebody that represents sort of tectonic clarity and industrialization and fabrication and now you're saying it's all TV. So because architects have this hatred of television, and I suppose getting back to Felicity's point, it's super interesting that moment of the 60s and 70s where there are architects, and if you take television out of their work, the work is gone, right? And I think that maybe I'm now trying to answer the first question, right? Like today, probably you could take out TV in its old form and it wouldn't really change the work of writers, scholars, designers, and so on. Whereas there's this moment that it would. So I think you can sort of see Wachsmann before, Wachsmann after. And it's astounding how influential Wachsmann was on the so-called radicals, like in Vienna and London and Tokyo and Milan and so on. They're all like, they receive him intravenously. And then but he himself is never treated as a radical. So there's sort of like this, he has this weird status of being a figure of authenticity somehow. And I have yet to kind of fully understand that. And part of me thinks it might even be a sort of a psychosexual thing that Wachsmann is a figure of control, like an almost Germanic control of organization and these formidable charts and drawings. So he's sort of like a kind of accountant for architecture, a kind of Excel spreadsheet visionary, and therefore he's granted a kind of pass. Like he can't be too interested. He's like, it's as if he's sort of fundamentally boring because he's so mathematical, let's say. And this seems to, and of course my fascination is to say, no, he's hardcore. He's sort of so radical you can't even position him as a radical, and it needed a second order generation to sort of manifest it. And then that generation got really seriously forgotten until, for example, Felicity, your work, like brings back into focus this work, which is, as you say, ant farm. Without television, there's no ant farm. Like it's not an ant farm. It's like, it's not a farm. It's a kind of TV thing, right? But do you find yourself still lingering on that work? Like you yourself, you continue to sort of obsess about, obsess, I mean, in the fetishistic sense, like really think through the 60s?
Well, in all sorts of peculiar ways, but maybe to come back, to your earlier point about the sort of political ambivalence of some of these forms of engagement, and we can't blame Ant Farm for the fact that ARPANET came out of the military and that they, attempted to refunction it and imagine other worlds through it. But right at that moment, they're also their own visibility is being scripted in part by Stuart Brand. So to come back to your more recent question, do I find myself coming back to it? Yes, I'm endlessly puzzled by the fact that Stuart Brand, in a way, had a much smarter attitude to how to perform a connection to network modes of thinking. So on the one hand, he produced a print magazine, the whole catalog that was a feedback device. On the other hand, he, as he puts it, brings like computer freaks and long hairs together in events like Paradigm and all these networking structures where all of a sudden you have hippies and sort of experimental architects right next to like Peter Deutsch, or characters from like Xerox PARC and ARPA. And I point this out because Brand is like at the very first demonstration of Douglas Engelbart's like online system. He's holding the video camera for the very first time a teleconferencing event, happens.
Right.
And yet he doesn't ever speak about that. He goes on and develops a catalog that most people read in terms of do-it-yourself, sort of low-tech. So to come back to your question, I mean, if Wachsmann, let's say, was always in your reading, channeling electricity, like understanding the degree to which the material world had been radically reconfigured by information, and he remained somewhat closer to, material engineering, the tectonic, apparently so, but was actually doing something else. And only desublimated that, toward in the 1970s, beautifully with like decades of intelligence about
right.
television. Then that would also suggest us, I don't know. You're making me think a little bit about Brand, because I mean I read Brand as a sort of cynicism of understanding what to reveal and what to conceal, understanding how power works and who he needs to be in line with, but what he needs to put forward as a public front, which is that of, the guy in the, neo-indigenous clothing, in a teepee, I'm I'm not likening Wachsmann to him, but I keep coming back to Brand to try and understand his role, and so Anfam often comes along with them, and
yeah.
But once you start looking, there's televisions in everybody I work on, like Juan Downey, the Chilean architect that ends up as a video artist, or the Architecture Machine Group and all their work with
Right.
And so, I began to feel a bit embarrassed, thinking, I just always work on TV.
Yeah, it's a bit like, now when they put on television, if we can use that expression, warnings, they have warnings that go like nudity, language, but sometimes they say smoking. And I wonder if the television now has become one of those things. It's sort of like this embarrassing thing that used to be visible in architecture somehow, but we would just rather, or we at least we'd like to warn people that there is this TV thing. Keller, TVs that turn up in your landscapes already, or not so much?
TVs turn up in the landscape. Yeah, they are part of, well, as we were saying, sort of ideas about e-governance in this, and the satellite networks for different countries. The idea that you, especially for the non-aligned countries, that you would use these satellites that were launched either by the US or by the USSR, and that would be part of this, digital pollen or microwave, world that would be then transmitted through Earth stations and stuff. So that infrastructure is hugely important in governance.
And remains so, right? Or that gets multiplied a bit, or
and it now the sort of topology of it is slightly different when it's microwaves going through cell phone towers delivered by a fiber optic cable. So they switch around. Sometimes it's radio and it's totally or mostly airborne, and then it goes back to being physical and grounded, and so there's this kind of constant shifting between where the power and is in a morphological organization, and then the devices too, whether the devices are can be transported or not. So the handset changes everything. But I still end up thinking about from 45 a Memex that Van der Waal-Bush did, which is basically the iPad, or Wachsmann's dream of this pocket, basically iPhone that he's talking about, that you write about, with a little thing which you can use to broadcast and take pictures and so on. So the history is jagged in that way, in that there's dreams of devices, and then they happen, and then there are different power structures that take them over and monopolize them, and it's a shifting landscape. It's not a steady state at all.
Right. And it affects the time or whatever, right? Because it's Wachsmann always insisted, if I'm right, the word future for him meant sort of the unknown, right? The future was by definition going to be shocking, unpredictable, unplannable, undesignable, but you nevertheless had to sort of design towards it, knowing that you'd be wrong. So he kind of had this double message. You've got to kind of aim to the future, knowing that your aim will be wrong and that you will be shocked by what happens. And yet, so that's his position, right? And yet, as you say, his particular description of the future sounds pretty much like what we've got. And maybe Stuart Brand, and so there's this strange, again, getting back to this sort of reversing McLuhan thing, there's maybe it's just a philosophical thing, right? That if you're so convinced that the future will be different than what you expect. Finally, what would be shocking would be for it to be exactly what you expected. Like finally, these radicals arrive in the so-called future, and it's just what they thought. And I would get sort of Buckminster Fuller in there as well, and Leonidov and others who in the 20s were already thinking interactive, you know, a year after TV is first shown, they say, okay, that's going to be, on the one hand, the perfect kind of more or less capitalist society, and on the other hand, the more or less perfect socialist society unified by interactive television. And I think that, you know, sort of Wachsmann's part of that line. So that there's a lot of figures in our field, if we can say that were kind of right or kind of accurate or precise. And then their politics are somewhat embarrassing, or it's embarrassing for us to try to figure out how to read them politically. You know, both Wachsmann and Fuller intimately involved with the military, but also, you know, adopting a kind of post-military, you know, position. So it's either interesting or hypocritical or whatever it is. And it kind of, I was going to ask Keller, because when I listen to you, I always feel that you show how the scripts, particularly the technological scripts, seem to have inside of them alternative scripts or other stories, which are only slightly different and yet revolutionary by virtue of, you know, that. And I'm just wondering whether television, whatever that might mean, is a kind of scripting device in the sense that you describe, like it sort of sets out a series of possible stories that we can tell each other, which then become ways of living and communicating, and also treating other people and other species terribly or whatever. Whether even the word television already implies one set of scripts, let's say, that are not open to too much change, or whether it's a kind of opportunity for alternative scripts. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I suppose the thing I keep thinking about are all these characters who are, you know, seeing information period as the elementary particle. Information, right. You know, whether it's, you know, Bateson or whether it's a microwave or whether it's electrons or whatever, that this is the elementary particle that is also then the subject of yet another universal. So, I mean, in the sense that what I keep seeing, and the reason why I don't think it's post-TV is that it's not a progression at all. What one keeps seeing, the recurring script, is a really mothballed old script. You know, it's a script of a universal. It's a script of liberation. It's a script of democracy. It's a script that's always talking about decentralization and always re-centralizing everything. Right. That's the kind of old, worn out, you know, it's still the modern Enlightenment mind at work, no matter what technology it has in its hands. That's the recurring script.
Yeah, I was super struck when you were saying that I think in 1927, when they make that first display of an electrical TV rather than a mechanical one, there's a newspaper article pretty much immediately that somebody says, okay, the future of business is you don't go and see anyone, you sit in your room and you have a set of screens and you talk to them. And you know, I'm looking at the two of you, there we are. So our current situation was very much described in 1927, which really resonates with your thought that nothing had changed. And then I was thinking about that just now, like, oh yeah, because maybe the script is so good that we remain scripted by that story. In other words, there is this sort of script that says that, you know, architecture could give way to information. And actually, it still has a certain coolness in our field. For example, if a young architect says, I really think it's all about information, that's thought to be something, you know, that we should pay attention to and so on, as distinct from saying, yeah. So you're back in the 20s. So it's so there's a sort of fetish for certain words like information that become more constraining maybe than the sort of supposedly solid architecture that such people think that they're going to bypass. You know what I mean?
Unless if I could just,
Yeah.
maybe like some of the most interesting media theorists now are returning to sort of an elemental media, or media as it means middle. So then
Right.
all the lumpy solids are also an information system.
Right.
And
Right.
that I think is an incredibly empowering thing for us.
Right. But that, for Felicity, for you, the word information is everywhere, right? In almost all of your books and your research, it exists as a kind of sort of central theme of the people that you're writing about. I was thinking even of Oscar and Sophia Hansen and the whole open form, because again, some sort of idea about communication and information is thought to destabilize and open up architecture physically, politically, emotionally, and so on.
Responding to that, I might actually come back to Juan Downey, for whom the architect is to be reinvented as the information worker. And I want to mention that to tie back to this question of a type of political ambivalence within the systems of information that somebody like Wani was working with. And so he imagined that the role of the architect was to be a sort of agent who would understand with some precision all of the different spectrums of rays, cosmic rays, all the different sort of levels of energy, visible and invisible, that were coursing through the environment, and that they would then actually be able to impact and produce forms of switching, like actively mobilize that ambivalence to other ends. And so so he was modeling systems of capture and redirection, and with a sort of utopian valence, but also with an understanding of just how complicated that space was to work in with an architect. And he makes this, I'm going to get the term wrong, this incredible argument that architecture is at once shelter and invasion. So I think from information rays, in all their different sort of manifestations. But yes, I'm feeling a bit embarrassed about being so much on the side of the information question. And at the moment, I'm increasingly trying to think about the ways in which circuits of information touch down in incredibly material ways in often in other geographies to that of the location of the knowledge worker or the cultural worker of
right.
So that sort of complicated relationship between how information circulates, how it is stored, and so obvious examples like the enormous energy that takes to cool server farms and these sorts of things, that sort of material work, but also around the redistribution of labor. This is an old story, also going back to the early 1970s. And so I've been doing this work on this urban commune in San Francisco, launched in the early 70s, that reoccupied an old industrial site, south of Market in San Francisco. And the commune got one of the, somehow obtained an SDS 940 in 1971 and used that to reconfigure these community memory networks. And super ambivalent, under the rubric of leaving Berkeley around US entry into Cambodia, but actually then operating in this very parallel way of thinking information topologies. And I point this out because that location, of course, previously being the site of all sorts of migrant industrial labor forces that had, of course, been moved by that point to cheaper labor pools in the third world, the so-called global south. And so I think for me, this, I'm trying to think those connections, like how you think information in relationship to very material sites and agents of labor. And I don't know where I'm going with that, but this dynamic over and over again. And so all the sort of time and space components that were dreamed in a futuristic sense through information networks are now also creating new archaisms, and so.
Right. I mean, maybe the word information is sort of like an avatar. Maybe it was always an avatar. It's a kind of being that moves through conversations and around conversations, but it's sort of actually a kind of portal to a whole world that can't be named. So it's a kind of like it has of course this sort of scientific, it has this sort of mathematical kind of resonance, but actually maybe its actual role is much more mystical and again it reminds me of Keller's way of seeing infrastructure so delicate and so shifty, and more deadly through its shiftiness than through its sort of fixity. And I think that Wachsmann thought that television was not the word for the TV set or the program, but a kind of undoing. So it's just a kind of. He often said he hated TV, and thought if anybody thought that they didn't like TV, that's not. He just thought television was the word for the future. It was what will be there when what is there now is not there, and in that sense, it's romantic. It's a kind of a romance with this word TV. TV is like a kind of dream lover that you would have a relationship with, and afterwards it all would be spectacular. And maybe the dream, became a bit of a nightmare or something. But it is about narratives and stories, and I think that Wachsmann thought of architecture as medium. I think he thought of it as medium, but really medium like a spiritualist. Like it had to become sort of spooky. And so all of these drawings, like the ones that are behind us, are all kind of trying to make a cloud out of buildings without ever without ever giving up on a portrayal of masculinity, of engineering, of mathematics, of organization, actually not, having the cloud remain, not allowing the cloud to be diminished relative to prejudices, right? So somehow a kind of techie kind of boys cloud, if you like, but ultimately the cloud would undo that prerogative, right? So this seems to me what the politics of Wachsmann ultimately is. It's sort of like to use architecture against itself. So always playing it by the rules, but finally the rules become almost nothing. And when it's almost nothing, it's like a medium, because then if it's almost nothing, then almost anything could happen. And I keep thinking of, because Keller, you do so-called fiction and so-called non-fiction, but I don't know how that, whether that's a legitimate distinction relative to your work, but you are thoroughly in the moment of writing fiction. You don't leave whatever architecture is behind, right? So in a certain way, you do something similar with your work, which is to sort of never just say, well, I'm leaving the room. You don't leave the room. And yet the room becomes something else after you've done your thing, right?
Well, I'm going to talk about your book because I ended up thinking at the end of it that it was just the perfect story for you to tell. We were talking about this before, but it almost like that you go into the archives and the archives unfold in a sequence which is all about what you've been thinking about, and it sort of starts from these material projects and then gradually dematerialize, but the dematerialization was there all along, because what was it after all? They were cables and wires that were making those. That it was about how the world was wired, and then you end up with this kind of person who's thinking through how that reflects on academic education, and then finally this paradoxical character who, yes, was so much maybe too much obsessively at the hub of his many spokes, often, even in his creative. Right. but I just keep thinking about the script he wrote that you talk about, where the opening would be him going in a car, in a convertible, down in through the city, and then he would come up through an elevator, and then there would be no host with a desk or anything like that. He would just be this kind of particle that would be moving around. So he was really both those things. You know, you said even that his practice was a broadcast in a way, which seemed so right. There wasn't that much built, you know, it was really just where his ideas will land.
Can I add one tiny footnote to that? That is just such a perfect reading of the book, which is the moment of the book's arrival. Yeah, so the book ends on universities being displaced by television, and it's launched in not only a television program that itself an archaism, but a moment where we're all living online. I just couldn't be a sort of perfectly synchronized sort of dance between you and Wachsmann, and I think this is really beautiful as well.
So, well, maybe we're getting close to, I feel, a degree of embarrassment coming along. So I think that we are going to end soon. But what you describe, if it's true, and it sounds right, it is another version of the same story, right? Because is this book, the Wachsmann TV book, is it a work of fiction or not? I guess this is what I meant, Keller. Is it fiction or not? And of course, I would say, well, it's brutally archival, and there's not a single thing that's not pinned down, and there's more facts than you need, and all of that. But a la Wachsmann, the idea is to sort of, as it were, play it by those rules and say, actually, if you were to take Wachsmann seriously, to actually read Wachsmann, you would end up in some gauzy, ephemeral, indeterminate space in which lots of kind of decisions that you used to make about what's building, what's an architect, what's the left, what's the right, and so on, don't really work anymore. And that would explain why we haven't talked about Wachsmann for a long time, because there's this sort of terrorist element to this, that for all of the talk in our field about dematerialization, about computational systems and a sort of de-authorship in favor of clouds, even the word cloud itself, like playing a really big role in our field now. In a certain sense, maybe our field would not really like that to happen. So there's not huge support for the kind of cloud production department of our film, our TV discipline. And yet there it is. And it's interesting that the three of us, one of the many things in common is to sort of find these scripts that are already there, and then just to sort of rehearse them and repeat them. I think this little book is just basically repeats a lot what Wachsmann repeated a lot. And one of the things he kept repeating was that he was not the author. I mean, so it's this issue too. I would love to say I wasn't the author of this little book that I just did, but I just said it. I just did, right? So I'm officially the author, and yet I feel as more like a medium. I would prefer a cape, some sort of, and a sort of a darker room and all of that. But I try to make a speech out of this in a way, because I still think that our field remains incredibly nervous around the very things that we have talked about for 100 years or so, even longer, following Keller's lead, that, for at least maybe 2 centuries, maybe the middle of the 19th century on, there has been sort of sitting right in front of us this sort of very different way to think buildings and people and species and so on. And we sort of touch it, but we actually don't want it to happen, And so just to finish with this one example, Wachsmann says that Crystal Palace is sort of like the beginning of the end of architecture. It's like literally architecture on its way out. It's the exit. It's like the last thing you will see before architecture goes. And Siegfried Gideon says that Crystal Palace is the beginning of modern architecture, right? So sort of the standard narrative is that actually architecture comes out of the cloud and becomes modern. And Wachsmann is saying actually it's going to go the other way. And I just am personally obsessed with these anti-architectural figures. And anti-architectural might just be, I just learning from you as always, that maybe that just mean anti-architecture just means sort of like running in the other direction. It's not, for or against architecture. It's just sort of going the other way. And I don't know. it remains a permanent obsession. I suppose also related to the thought that it would be nice to annoy architecture. And I would like to feel like at some level having done that, but I think that the two of you have annoyed architecture much more than me. So the embarrassment now has to be yours, finally. Because you both have this canny, I mean, both canny, and again, using the discipline directly towards indirect means. And I think this is sort of the Wachsmann thing. I mean, I think Wachsmann is just obviously a figment of my imagination. It's perfectly embodied in the archive, like a science fiction story where there is a species whose genetic material lies there in the archive waiting to be, brought to life for a book. But maybe our field is just riddled with this genetic material and again, I think, Keller, I think of your other stories, other scripts that you keep sort of tantalizing us with. The genetic material for these other scripts is just there, and we're afraid, so terribly afraid of it. I mean, we, the university. Anyway, what about a last thought? Because I'd hate to be the last one. Keller, what do you think?
Well, I was just thinking about how that both of you as historians, by doing your job so precisely, as you do with this book, you can create these magic things, just with this incredible precision and this almost this kind of what's he's called this kind of science, what Latour would call kind of scientific fiction, because or what I would call sort of footnoted fiction, because it's just such a great story, and it's such a great story book precisely because it's true.
Whatever that means.
As Pincher would say, it's more than true, it's a fact.
Yeah. Any last thoughts, Felicity?
No, just to say something like I stand in solidarity to a project in which we find all the ways in which architecture sort of self-indicts.
Right.
It needs to be made accountable, if not directly, but through narrative structures that do rewrite, histories and present. So yes, happy to be part of the team.
So this is the idea of self-indicting architecture. That's a dream for me. So I think it proves my point that it was just the best possible way to begin these conversations with the two of you. So thank you so much.
And congratulations, Mark.
Congratulations.
We'll see. Bye. Wow, that was good.
I thought I was going to go through